The dining room table was cleared on a Saturday morning, and everything that had been on it, the salt and pepper shakers, the placemats, the bowl of fruit that nobody touched, was moved to the counter because the plans had arrived. They came rolled in a cardboard tube, folded into thirds inside the kit box, a sheet of paper so large that when you unrolled it across the surface of the table, it hung over the edges on 3 sides and had to be weighted at the corners with whatever was heavy enough and small enough to serve: a glass, a book, a jar of rubber cement, while you stood over it and took in what it was asking of you. The sheet was printed in blue ink on cream paper, and it showed in precise elevation and plan view every rib and every spar and every former and every stringer of a Supermarine Spitfire in a scale large enough that the wingspan of the finished model would measure somewhere between 36 and 48 inches, depending on which Sterling kit it was, large enough to require 2 hands to lift and to fill the field of vision in flight in a way that smaller models could not. The Balsa was in the box. The smell of it reached you when you opened the lid. That specific, dry, faintly sweet smell that has no precise equivalent in the adult world of lumber and construction materials. A smell that belongs to craft rather than to industry, that is associated with making rather than building in the larger sense, with the intimate scale of a thing assembled by hand at a table rather than constructed by machinery in a factory. The Balsa was die cut, the parts stamped out of sheets by a die in a factory somewhere. The cuts not perfect, with a slight fuzz at the edges that would require sanding before the parts could fit the plan. But the shape's correct, the scale accurate, the organization of the sheets showing the thinking of someone who had built the prototype and understood the sequence in which the parts had to be constructed. The ribs were the beginning. A model aircraft wing is built from the outside in, or rather from the inside out. The ribs first, then the spars, then the leading and trailing edges. Then the sheeting if the design called for sheeting, then the covering. Each rib was a thin slice of balsa, cut to the airfoil profile shown on the plan, sized to fit into the notches of the spars with an exactness that depended on how carefully you sanded the fuzz from the edges of the die cut. You pinned the plan to the building board with T-pins through wax paper so the wood wouldn't stick to the plan. And you built the wing directly over the drawing, using the drawing as a template, putting each rib in its exact position before you glued it, checking it square to the board before the glue set. This is a description of patience. Not patience as a virtue in the abstract sense, but patience as a physical practice. The specific, embodied experience of doing one thing at a time and allowing each thing to be complete before moving to the next. The wood required it. The glue required it. The plan required it. The model that you were going to fly at the end of this process required it. And if you did not give it what it required, the flight would tell you what you had gotten wrong in a way that was immediate and unambiguous and sometimes irreversible. If the memory of sitting at a table like that one is something you carry, if the smell of balsa and rubber cement and beauty rate dope is still findable somewhere in your memory, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Not for the algorithm. Stories like this one don't vanish in the same quiet way that the culture they describe has largely vanished. The record of what it felt like to do this and what it meant to do it belongs to the people who remember it, and keeping it requires their participation. Sterling Models Incorporated was a New York company whose origins reach back to the pre-war period, when the model aviation hobby was still finding its shape as an American cultural institution. The company produced kits throughout the 1930s and 1940s, and into the post-war decades, surviving and adapting through the shifts that the market imposed, until the early 1980s, when the general contraction of interest in traditional kit building that affected the entire model aviation industry proved too severe to outlast. What Sterling made for much of its history were flying model aircraft kits in balsa and spruce in tissue, the materials of the pre-war and immediate post-war era that defined the physical experience of model building for 2 generations of American hobbyists. The kits followed a tradition of construction that was already established when Sterling entered it. Die-cut or printwood parts, full-size plans, tissue covering, dope finish, rubber motor, or engine power. What Sterling contributed to this tradition was a particular emphasis on scale fidelity and the production of models large enough to matter aerially. Models whose wingspans began at the level where a flying scale aircraft could be recognized in the air as the historical aircraft it represented. The catalog covered the warbirds that the men who returned from the Second World War had seen or flown or worked on or fought against. The Spitfire, the P-51 Mustang, the P-40 Warhawk with its distinctive shark-mouth nose art, the Stearman PT-17 biplane trainer in which a generation of American military pilots had taken their first turns in a cockpit, the Bell P-63 King Cobra, the Fokker D-7, the Newport 17, the RAF SE-5A, the Fairchild PT-19, the Curtiss JN-4 Jenny. These were not abstract aircraft to the adults who bought the kits in the late 1940s and through the 1950s. They were the aircraft of a recent and specific history, and the men who had been close to them as pilots, as ground crew, as observers watching from below, had a relationship to those shapes that made building a scale model of them something more than a hobby. It was a way of preserving something, of holding it, saying in the specific language of balsa and tissue and dope that this machine mattered, and the experience of being near it mattered, and the willingness to spend weeks reproducing its shape at 1/12th or 1/16th or 1/20th scale was a form of acknowledgement that the machine deserved. The world that received Sterling's kits in the post-war decades was a world in which mail-order catalogs were the primary means through which most American hobbyists discovered what was available to them. The hobby shop in your town might carry some Sterling kits and might carry all of them, depending on the size of the town and the inclination of the shop's owner and the particular mix of the manufacturer's-distributor relationship in your region. But the catalog, typically a multi-page document printed on newsprint or on better paper depending on the company's resources, listing every kit with a photograph or a line drawing and a brief description and a price. The catalog was where you first encountered what was possible. The ritual of the catalog was its own specific pleasure. You could spend an evening with it, reading the descriptions of kits you could not yet afford, and imagining the process of building them, measuring the wingspan dimensions against the span of your outstretched arms, to understand the scale of what was being described. The Sterling catalog of the 1950s and 1960s offered kits across a range of sizes and skill levels, from the smaller models that a beginner could complete in a few evenings to the larger scale warbirds that represented a serious commitment of time and skill, and the particular willingness to undertake something that would take weeks rather than days, and would require the development of capabilities that you did not yet have. This is what the larger Sterling kits asked for. Not just patience, which every kit required. They asked for the capacity to maintain investment in a long project, to return to the building board evening after evening, sometimes for a month or more, making incremental progress through stages that were sometimes satisfying and sometimes frustrating and sometimes simply requiring repetition until the technique was developed enough to produce an acceptable result. The wing that warped during covering, the fuselage that racked slightly out of square because a former was glued before it was properly aligned, the tissue that tore when the dope hit it because the dope was applied too wet or the tissue was held too tight during application. These were the failures that taught the craft, and the craft was teachable only through the specific experience of failing and understanding why and trying again. This positioned Stirling's larger kits in a particular place in the model aviation culture. They were not for beginners who wanted immediate gratification, and they were not for the specialists who were pushing the technical frontier of what radio-controlled scale flight could be. They were for the intermediate and advanced builder who had come through the smaller kits and the simpler constructions and who was ready to commit to something that would take real time and produce a result proportional to that investment. These were the builders who had already learned the lesson that small models teach, that the model is honest about the quality of the work that went into it, that the glue joint shows, that the covering reveals the frame beneath it, that the flight tells you everything about whether the structure was built correctly, and who were ready to apply that knowledge at a scale where it mattered more. A Stirling F-51 Mustang in a 40-inch wingspan version was, when it was built correctly, a genuine aeronautical achievement at miniature scale. The wing's taper was correct. The fuselage's proportions matched the original. The bubble canopy, if the kit included a vacuform plastic canopy, which the better Stirling kits did, gave the model the distinctive silhouette that made the Mustang recognizable from any angle. The Fokker D7, the SE-5A, the Newport 17, the great war aircraft that Stirling also produced in its catalog, had their own aeronautical logic, their own structure, their own relationship between lift and drag that the builder could feel in the balance and the trim of the finished model. Building them was a form of encounter with the engineering of the originals that no static display model could provide, because the flying model had to work in the same medium as the aircraft it represented, had to generate real lift and real stability, had to navigate real air. The men who were fathers in the 1950s and 1960s, many of them veterans, most of them competent with tools in the way that their generation was competent with tools, accustomed to fixing things and making things and operating in the physical world with a directness that the post-war prosperity had not yet transformed into the habit of buying solutions rather than making them. These men brought their sons to the hobby shop and bought the kits and sat at the table on weekend afternoons and evenings and built alongside the boys who were learning from them not just the specific techniques of model building, but the general disposition that physical things required physical engagement, that there was no substitute for attention, that the model would tell you what you had gotten wrong and would reward you when you got it right. The Saturday afternoon that was given to a Stirling build was a specific kind of time. It was unhurried in a way that our current relationship with time has made it hard to reconstruct imaginatively. Time with no competing claim, no notification, no alternative activity offering itself as a reason to stop. The dining room table or the workshop bench or the basement building board was cleared, the plans were spread, the parts were organized, and the afternoon was given to the work. The progress was visible and measurable. This afternoon, the left wing panel completed and waited flat to dry. Next Saturday, the right panel. The Saturday after that, the fuselage formers installed and the stringers run. The Saturday after that, the two halves joined and the joint sanded smooth. Week by week, the model assembled itself out of the accumulated hours, and the person who accumulated them could see at any point exactly where they were in the process and how far they had to go. The transmission that happened at those tables was real. It is the kind of transmission that does not require formal instruction or institutional context. It required only proximity. A person who knew something being in the same space as a person who did not know it yet, working on the same thing, in the same unhurried time, where the knowing was visible in the hands and the not knowing was visible in the hesitation, and the result of the hesitation was something concrete and correctable. The building ritual had a sequence that was not arbitrary. The sequence was dictated by the structure of the aircraft and the properties of the materials, and learning the sequence was itself a form of education in why aircraft are built the way they are built. The fuselage came first in most Sterling designs. The central body of the aircraft, built up from rectangular frames of spruce and balsa, around which the rest of the structure would eventually be organized. The fuselage was built in two halves on the plan. Over the wax paper, the formers placed at their marked stations, and the stringers run between them and the whole assembly, glued and left to cure before the two halves were joined. The process of joining the two halves was a moment of commitment. Whatever alignment errors you had introduced into either half would now be fixed in place, and the fuselage that emerged from the joining would be straight or it would not be straight. And if it was not straight, you had learned something important about the need to check alignment at every stage rather than assuming that things had worked out correctly. The wings were built in the same spirit of sequential fidelity. The spars first, then the ribs, fitted to the spars and each other in the sequence shown on the plan, glued and pinned, and left to cure with the assembly still pinned to the building board to prevent warping. The leading edge, which in most of these designs was a strip of harder balsa that would be sanded to an airfoil shape after the wing was assembled, running the full span from root to tip. The trailing edge, same material, same process, the whole assembly gradually becoming recognizable as a wing, the way a drawing becomes recognizable as an image only when enough of the lines are in place. Cover with tissue. This step was where the aircraft began to look like what it was going to be. And it was also the step where beginners most often ran into difficulty. The tissue had to be cut and applied dry, not wet, which would cause it to sag, but dry and under gentle tension, folded around the leading and trailing edges and tacked in place with a small brush dipped in very dilute dope applied to the edges only. The body of the tissue was left untouched until the edges were secure, and then the whole surface was misted with water from a spray bottle to tighten the tissue against the structure, shrinking it slightly as it dried so it conformed to the airfoil shape of the ribs beneath it. The tissue itself was a specific material with a specific character, thinner than typing paper, translucent when held to light, strong along its grain and fragile across it, available in the colors appropriate to the historical aircraft or in natural white that would take the tinted dope that old-time builders mixed to achieve the correct shade. Silk span, a finer, stronger variant of covering tissue, was the material of choice for larger models where structural demands were higher and the risk of surface damage greater. Silk span had a texture to it, a slight weave visible under certain lighting conditions that gave the finished model a surface quality different from paper tissue, more resilient, more forgiving, more capable of surviving the minor abrasions of handling and transport. The process of applying these materials was not fast. And the knowledge that it was not going to be fast was part of what the builder accepted when they opened the box. The tissue or silk span for a single wing panel might take an afternoon to apply correctly, cutting the material to shape with a slight allowance at the edges, positioning it over the structure, and securing the edges before committing to the final application. Running the water or dilute dope over the surface to initiate the shrinking. Watching the material tighten and wondering if it had been applied with the right tension to pull tight without pulling off the trailing edge. The answer would come as the dope dried, and the answer was either a drum-tight surface that rang when tapped, or a surface that was slightly loose or that had a small bubble or pucker that would have to be addressed with a careful additional application of water and tension. Then dope duty to because the dope shrank the tissue further as it dried, pulling it tight against the ribs, making the surface taut and resilient, creating the characteristic translucent skin that let you see the structure beneath it in strong light. The ribs visible through the covering, the spars visible, the whole internal logic of the structure visible through the surface that concealed it. The smell of dope is its own category of memory. Butyrate dope has a chemical sharpness that no current common material quite replicates. Not paint, not lacquer, not any of the synthetic coverings that replaced the dope and tissue tradition in later years. It is the smell of transformation, in the specific sense that applying dope to tissue transforms the surface from fragile to resilient, from loose to taut, from something that tears when you touch it to something that rings when you tap it. People who built with dope remember the smell the way they remember the smell of libraries or machine shops or other specific environments that were the setting for experiences that mattered. The finished model, before paint and detail, was a thing of particular beauty. Balsa and spruce structure beneath tissue doped the color of old ivory. The ribs visible through the surface in the right light. The whole assembly light in the hand. Lighter than it had any right to be given the number of hours that had gone into it, and balanced at the center of gravity that the plan had specified, which you verified by balancing it on your fingers at the marked point and finding it level, or adjusting ballast until it was. The paint followed. Dope base paint for the covering, enamel or acrylic for the details. The distinctive markings of the historical aircraft, the RAF roundels of the Spitfire, the Flying Tiger's shark mouth of the P-40, the star and bar of the American military aircraft, applied by brush or by the early airbrush techniques that serious modelers of the era had begun to develop. A well-finished Sterling Spitfire, or P-51 Mustang, was a visual document of the aircraft it represented, recognizable not just in silhouette, but in the specific colors and markings that placed it in a particular theater of a particular war. Then the field. The maiden flight was a test of everything that had preceded it. A Sterling scale flyer did not go to the field with the casual assumption that it would fly. That assumption had to be earned through the careful work of construction and balance and trim adjustment, and the field would tell you immediately whether you had earned it. The model either flew or it did not, and if it did not, the nature of its failure told you something. A hard left roll meant the aileron needed adjustment. A sharp pitch up on takeoff meant the center of gravity was too far aft. A refusal to climb meant the incidence was wrong, or the engine was not running correctly. The field was the final examination, and it graded without sentiment. The culture that Sterling's kits inhabited began to change in ways that the company could not control and could not easily adapt to. The changes were not sudden. They accumulated through the 1960s and 1970s and early 1980s in the way that cultural changes always accumulate, gradually, then with increasing speed, until what had been the normal condition of a hobby was no longer normal, and the practitioners of the old normal found themselves in a minority position that the market could not sustain. The first change was demographic and invisible as it was happening. The men who had returned from the Second World War and who had been the natural audience for Sterling's warbird kits, men for whom the Spitfire and the Stearman were not history but recent and personal experience, or aging through the 1960s and into the 1970s. Their sons, who might have been initiated into the hobby at the building tables of the 1950s, were now adults with their own children, and the transmission that had happened between fathers and sons at those tables was not guaranteed to continue to the next generation. The hobby required transmission. It was not something that people came to independently, without exposure. The exposure happened at the table, or at the hobby shop, or at the flying field, where someone who knew how to build was in proximity to someone who did not yet know, and that proximity was becoming rarer. The plastic model kit had been gaining ground since the late 1950s. Revell and Monogram and Airfix and Aurora were producing injection-molded plastic kits of the same warbirds that Sterling built in balsa and tissue, and the plastic kits had an appeal that was straightforward and not illegitimate. They were faster to build, cleaner to work with, required no special tools or techniques beyond a knife and paint and patience, and could produce a finished display model of genuine visual quality in an afternoon or a weekend rather than in weeks. For the portion of the hobby's population that wanted a finished warbird on the shelf, more than they wanted the experience of building the warbird, the plastic kit was the better answer. This is not a judgment. It is an observation about the difference between two things that are superficially similar and are, in the sense that matters most, quite different. The plastic model kit and the Sterling balsa kit both produced a model aircraft. What they produced in the builder was something else entirely. The balsa kit produced a builder. The plastic kit produced an assembler. The distinction is not about intelligence or skill. The finest plastic modelers of any era are craftspeople of real accomplishment. The distinction is about the nature of the engagement with the material. Whether the material resists you and requires you to develop capability to work it, or whether the material is already shaped and requires only that you fit the pieces correctly. Resistance is where learning happens. The balsa resisted. The plastic fit. The air revolution, almost ready to fly, arrived in the late 1980s and accelerated through the 1990s, and it represented the logical completion of the movement that the plastic kit had begun. If the plastic kit had removed the building from the building process, the ARF removed most of the remaining assembly from the process as well. The model arrived from the factory largely complete, covered, hinged, fitted with control surfaces, requiring only the installation of radio equipment and power system and a few hours of final preparation before it was ready for the field. The barrier to participation in the flying hobby had been reduced to almost nothing. The cost in time and skill was minimal. The reward of flight was immediate. The trade-off was equally clear to anyone willing to examine it. The person who bought an ARF and flew it was participating in aviation. they were not participating in building. The specific education that the building process had delivered, the patience, the attention, the relationship with physical materials, the understanding that things had to be done in sequence and that the sequence mattered and that the consequence of not following it was a result you would have to live with. That education was no longer part of the transaction. Sterling models fell victim to the general contraction of the traditional kit building market that took hold through the early 1980s. The company that had produced hundreds of kit designs spanning 4 decades of American model aviation history. That had been a name familiar to almost every serious builder of the post-war era. That had put the Spitfire and the P-40 and the Stearman PT-17 into garages and basements and dining rooms across the country, was no longer producing kits by the time the decade ended. The specific circumstances of the company's closing are less important than the general pattern of which the closing was a part. Sterling was not alone. Comet Models, which had been one of the major names in Balsa kits since the 1930s, closed. Scientific appeared in the noses of 1,000 designs in the hobbyist press. Closed. The field of balsa kit manufacturers that had been populated with dozens of serious companies in the 1950s and 1960s contracted in the 1970s and 1980s to a handful, and then to fewer. The immediate causes were multiple and reinforcing. The cost of manufacturing, the die cutting, the wood, the printing of full-size plans, the packaging and distribution through the hobby shop network had not decreased while the market for the product was shrinking. The hobby shop network itself was contracting. As the large mail-order retailers, Tower Hobbies, Hobby Lobby in its original incarnation, changed the economics of distribution in ways that the independent shop, which had been the primary channel through which Sterling kits reached their customers, could not survive. Each shop that closed took with it not just a distribution point, but the specific human knowledge that the shop had housed. The counterperson who knew the Sterling catalog and could recommend the right kit for the right skill level, and could tell you what to do when the tissue tore and what dope consistency was correct for a first coat. The digital entertainment revolution that arrived with increasing force through the 1980s was the background condition against which all of this was happening. The child who might have spent a Saturday afternoon at the building board in 1963 was, by 1983, as likely to be in front of a video game console. The leisure hours that had been available for the specific, slow, quiet pleasure of building a model aircraft over several weeks were being claimed by alternatives that offered faster feedback, more immediate reward, and the social validation of peers who were playing the same games in the same cultural moment. None of this happened maliciously. None of it was a deliberate decision to end something that had value. It was the normal operation of cultural change, of the market responding to shifts in how people wanted to spend their time, of technology creating new possibilities that were genuinely compelling and that the existing hobby could not offer. The people who chose video games over building boards were not wrong. They were responding to what was available and what their culture valued. What is lost in that transition is harder to quantify and easier to feel. It is the specific thing that building a Sterling warbird from a flat box of die-cut balsa and tissue gave to the person who built it, and that nothing else gives in quite the same way. The patience, yes. The attention, yes. The understanding of structure and material and the relationship between the two. But also something that is even harder to name. The experience of accomplishment that is proportional to investment. The weight of a finished wing in your hands. which is almost nothing in grams and is enormous in the other currency that things that cost effort accumulate. The first flight of something you made from scratch, which is not like any other first flight. Because you know everything that went into the thing that is flying, and you know what it cost, and you know what it means. The question that the Sterling story poses is not really a question about one company or one product line or one corner of the American hobby industry. It is a question about what happens to a culture when the slow things disappear. When the activities that required weeks rather than minutes are replaced by activities that deliver their reward immediately. And when the patience that the slow things demanded is no longer practiced because it is no longer required. Patience is a capability like any other. It is developed through practice and diminished through disuse. The child who builds a Sterling Spitfire over 4 or 5 or 6 weeks, who returns to the building board every evening and finds the wing slightly further along than it was the evening before, and understands that the evenings will accumulate into a completed aircraft, is practicing patience in the most direct possible way, by experiencing it as a productive state, as a condition in which real things happen at a pace that cannot be hurried without cost. That experience is formative. It shapes the relationship to long projects that the builder will have for the rest of their life. What happens when that experience is not available, or is available but not chosen, or is offered but not valued because the culture around it does not value it? What happens when the children of a generation grow up with the assumption, invisible because it is so pervasive that it resembles a fact about the world, that things should be fast, that waiting is a problem to be solved rather than a state to be inhabited, that the value of an activity can be measured by how quickly it produces its reward? The answer is not that the world ends, or that civilization collapses, or any of the dramatic consequences that commentary on cultural change sometimes invokes. The answer is subtler and more consequential. The specific capability that patience produces, the capacity to maintain investment in a long process, to tolerate the intermediate states in which the project is neither the raw material nor the finished thing, to trust that the accumulation of small daily progress will eventually amount to something worth having. That capability becomes less common, and its diminishment is felt everywhere that long projects are required. In engineering and in medicine and in science and in art and in every other human domain where the thing worth having is not available quickly, and patience is not optional. If you have built something from raw material, if you have experienced the specific earned quality of having made a thing rather than received it, leave your memory in the comments. The kit you remember, the aircraft you built, the dining room table you cleared, the weight of the finished wing in your hands for the first time. Those accounts are the record that institutions will not keep, and keeping them is a form of resistance to the forgetting that time performs on everything it can reach. Return to the table. The plans are spread across it, weighted at the corners. The balsa sheets are arranged beside the building board, the die-cut parts still nested in the sheets like the pieces of a puzzle that has not yet been assembled. The small jar of rubber cement is open, its distinctive smell mixing with the balsa dust from the sanding block and the faint chemical note of the butyrate dope on the shelf behind you. The T-pins are lined up at the edge of the board. The wax paper is laid over the plan drawing. This is where the Sterling Spitfire began, not in the factory where the balsa was die-cut, and the plans were printed and the tissue was cut and rolled, and the parts were organized into a flat box that would sit on a hobby shop shelf until someone carried it home. It began here, at this table, in the specific attention of the person who spread the plans and identified the first piece and understood, at the beginning of a project that would take weeks, that the weeks were the point. The hobby shops where those boxes sat are mostly gone now. The factories that produce the kits are gone. The men who taught their sons at building boards like this one are mostly gone. What remains is the testimony of the people who were at those tables, who remember the smell and the patience and the weight of the finished thing, and who understand that something specific was transmitted at those tables that does not transmit itself automatically or easily or through any other medium. The plans are still spread across the table. The first piece is waiting.